Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
I am an American Indian healer in training in northern Canada, learning part-time about communication with spirits and drawing power from nature and the earth. I will have to keep some of my personal information and certain experiences vague, and there is still a lot I don't know, but if anyone has questions about my religion or the rituals I've participated in thus far, I will make an effort to answer as best I can. I have permission from my teachers to talk candidly about most of my experiences, but I cannot provide pictures. I might drop in and out of the thread as long as it's up, but I will make a post saying when I'm done answering questions so nobody wastes a bump.
How did you find yourself in this role? Is it hereditary or something more like a calling you received?
Like a lot of religious people, I was very lost and in a bad way when I found it. I was a young adult, 19, and had just lost my girlfriend in an accident. I was handling my grief very poorly, and my grandfather thought a sweat would be appropriate. I was raised away from my tribe, half-blooded, and was visiting with my grandfather on the reserve when I went to my first sweat lodge ceremony. After what I experienced in the lodge, we'll elaborate, I decided I would make an effort to move back onto tribal land permanently and reconnect with my people. And when one of the teachers caught wind of my plans, he personally recommended that I start firekeeping to get started. He said I had the right demeanor and attitude for the job, and to learn, so I took his offer.
Are Wendigo, skinwalkers, or similar creatures real? Why do millions of people who camp or live in the wilderness never hear or interact with them? Not being skeptical, I want to hear your perspective. Are they confined to certain times or conditions? How does one protect oneself against them?
Skinwalkers are more of a Navajo southern tribe thing to my knowledge, but Wendigo are a somewhat common belief in my tribe. Their scarceness is explained by stories of them shape-shifting and manipulating rather than rampaging and hunting people, though they still do that. Wendigo work differently based on which tribe you ask and which clan within that tribe you ask. But the version I know is that they carry a vicious blizzard with them. Going out in the snow at night attracts them, and they will take the shape of another person lost in the blizzard to draw you in. Each winter usually kills at least one person where I live, and in some cases, it was people wandering off into snowstorms for no real reason, then suspiciously disappearing. So usually they lurk in the snow and look for people who are alone. However, the process of becoming a Wendigo is more nuanced. There is a very old belief that cannibalism is the worst sin, more so than murder. Eating another person is the most despicable, greedy, inhuman thing you can do, and demonstrates that you care for nobody but yourself. Like a drug, it is addictive, and no matter your reasons for doing it once, you will eventually want to do it again. Nature rejects you, giving you a form that is neither man nor animal, and makes you into a mindless monster that can only think of eating and taking things from others. Many eyes to greedily search for things to take, huge mouths to consume as fast as possible, huge bodies and strength to show they cannot be stopped without killing them, but scrawny and malnourished to show they will never be satisfied. You could take the story of the Wendigo as a warning against greed and corruption, or perhaps substance abuse, and that makes them very real. I do believe that, like the Wendigo, people can lose sight of themselves and lose their humanity, becoming something else. My first sweat, Part 1. I was brought out to one of the elders' homes early in the morning in late fall, where he, my main teacher, and a few others had already built a large fire and were collecting fresh green branches to form the frame of the lodge. They were then stuck into the ground and bent into a dome, then tied at the top. We didn't have enough skins to make a strictly traditional lodge, so we used tents and tarps for the cover. The dome was covered completely in multiple layers, and they were arranged so that absolutely no light could get in when the door flap was closed. At the bottom of the fire were heavy round river stones that were smooth all over, and one of my teachers, who I will call Black Bear, was in charge of keeping the fire steady and ensuring that the stones were glowing the right color and temperature. The idea is that you need old stones from a riverbed that are visibly aged and worn down, and thus allow water to run over them evenly, producing more steam. The smoother the stone, the cleaner it will burn. I respect Black Bear greatly, but everyone acknowledges he doesn't take ceremony as seriously as expected of him as an elder. While it's not disallowed, he spent too much of his time firekeeping, cracking jokes, and wandering away from the fire. I only spoke when spoken to, and spent most of the morning just staring into the fire, which apparently is what my teachers were looking for in a student. I was given a small handful of dried, shredded tobacco that Black Bear grew, and told to walk around the fire 3 times before throwing it in, saying "Miigwech" in thanks. This is meant to be an offering to the spirits who live in the lodge, and ask them to heal and cleanse you. Then I sat back down and we passed around a long wooden peace pipe my grandfather made. Each person around the fire would smoke a few puffs of the same tobacco as before, passing it clockwise, and turning the pipe in your hands 3 times before passing it on. My main teacher, who I will call Laughing Bear, made a joke about one of the grandmothers, the title for female elder who has had biological grandchildren, arriving in jeans. She went home to change into a skirt, and joked about the old idea that spirits can get confused about who you are if you're not dressed accordingly, and their guidance may not work if they think you're someone or something else. This is also why nobody wore animal skins or regalia to this sweat, though some different kinds of sweat allow it. Also, traditionally, a sweat is segregated by age and gender, so everyone has similar endurance. There are men's, women's, and elders' sweats, but my first one was mixed because we could only run one that year. My grandfather wasn't happy about it, but we went ahead. Inside the lodge was a shallow pit in the middle, and the dirt floor was covered in loose sand to dry it. When the Firekeeper, Black Bear, declared that the river stones were ready, the men stripped, and Laughing Bear began to sing and strike his buckskin drum with his hands. Traditionally, you'd go into the lodge nude, but shorts or underwear are acceptable. The women and kids were exempt because of the mix and entered fully clothed. The sweat lodge is meant to simulate the womb, and by entering you are re-entering the womb of the Mother Earth, so you may be reborn, stronger. I was seated next to the door, but there was a little boy, a little girl, a woman my age, an older woman, my grandfather and Laughing Bear all in when it was full. Before my grandfather and Laughing Bear entered, we were instructed to close our eyes until told otherwise. I did. Black Bear then took a pitchfork and started carrying in the glowing hot river stones, then placing them in the pit. Every time he put down a stone, my grandfather put a bit of cedar on the stone and let it burn. It made pure white smoke and squealed loudly. Its cries would attract mother spirits, like a baby. The lodge was small, and even sitting cross-legged I had to fold in half just to fit under the low roof. There was just enough room that I didn't burn my feet on the hot stones, but it was tight. The door was shut and we could open our eyes. It was pitch black. All you could see was the glowing stone and burning cedar. Already it was hot, and we sat in silence for a few minutes. I watched the cedar smoke form shapes, and was told to watch for anything I recognize. I saw a stag with long antlers many times. Then Black Bear knocked on the door flap, and we shut our eyes again as Laughing Bear started singing. This time he used the old tongue rather than wordless chants like before. I still don't have it memorized or know how to write it out with English letters, I'm afraid. Black Bear opened the flap and passed a pot of cold river water from the same river as the rocks to Laughing Bear. The door was shut, and Laughing Bear put down his drum to ladle water onto the stones. Immediately it was so hot and humid I could barely breathe, but he kept scooping on more, pouring slowly so he wouldn't cool the rocks too much. I coughed and felt like I was drowning. I thought I was sweating, but actually the steam in the air was condensing on my skin because I was so much cooler than the air. It was about 30 minutes before I really started to sweat. It felt like every pore on my body opened at once. I could feel it pouring down and soaking the sand. With the singing and drums, it was so loud that I couldn't pick out words anymore. I was dizzy and sick, especially since I'd been fasting for the whole day. It was completely overwhelming and at times very painful, but then I'd start sweating again and my skin would stop sizzling. Laughing Bear ended his song and told us each to cry out what was currently troubling or important to us. Be loud, be honest. Nothing leaves the lodge. I can't tell you what anyone said, including myself. The younger woman started sobbing uncontrollably and had to compose herself before the next spoke. When everyone was done speaking, there was an even louder song. Then the little ones left. This was about 1 hour in. It went on. More hot stones were added, and more cold water was poured. More cedar burned, and the drums got louder. 2 hours in, when the intensity went up again, the women left. At this point, I was shaking from heat exhaustion and fatigue, but if I slumped or passed out, I would burn my face on the stone, so I stayed up. I chanted along with Laughing Bear and my grandfather, if only to get the water out of my lungs. Then I started seeing things. As long as the door was shut and the elders said so, I could open my eyes. The first thing I saw was a ring of light around Laughing Bear's drum, pulsing every time he hit it with his shaker, slowly getting brighter. I could clearly see the outline of the shaker and the flashing light in the pitch black, even though I had seen neither his drum nor his shaker before I went in. When I saw the light, I shouted, but I couldn't look away no matter how far I turned my head. It got so hot that no matter how much I sweat, I still felt my face burning. Laughing Bear's and my grandfather's voices sounded like hundreds of voices, including women and children. Then my heart started pounding, which worried me because of my arrhythmia. Before I could panic, though, I felt hands on my back. It was like someone with thin, delicate woman's cool hands was pressing and massaging my back, calming me down like a baby. I heard more women's voices, including my late girlfriend, singing. That was when I lost control and started sobbing, but I had no tears, only sweat. My eyes were clear and I saw the drum light even while I was screaming. My hair was soaked and running down my back. It felt like it was burning me to touch my own hair, but the woman's hands washed it away before it got unbearable. I felt like I loved her. The lodge didn't get any cooler, but I did calm down. I saw flashing lights even when there was no singing, and I still felt a woman's hand stroking my back for at least an hour before it started to fade away. When water was dripping down my face, I thought it might be her fingers running over my cheeks and lips. By the time her hand completely faded, the door flap opened, and all of the steam escaped in a big cloud. We sat in the lodge for maybe 20 minutes while it emptied out and cooled down. Then I had to try and crawl out. I couldn't stand up. When I dragged myself out and collapsed, Black Bear told me I had been inside for almost 5 hours, and that I did well. I could have left at any point. My knees felt like they were on fire from being folded so tightly, and I felt like whenever I stretched, my skin was tearing. According to my grandfather, my eyes were bloodshot, completely red. I blacked out for a few minutes in the cold dirt, and someone threw my sweater over me. Then I woke up feeling perfectly rested. My skin was fine. I didn't feel dirty or greasy. The steam washed my actual sweat away. I didn't even smell. I felt remarkably clean. We went into Laughing Bear's house where his wife had cooked moose meat. I drank some of the river water that was used for the ceremony and felt calmer than I had in years. I didn't have any dreams right after, but I slept better than ever in my life that night. That was when I decided I wanted to learn more. I was only visiting that first time, but decided to move back up north and be with Bear Clan. I still do now. I still want to learn more. What I saw and felt in that first lodge will stay with me forever.
This one is my favorite. It's more modern, 1960s, but it used to give me nightmares. I'm not a great storyteller, so bear with me. Out on our reservation in Nevada, my grandmother would play around with all her siblings. Towards the back of our land was a small cemetery that the elders would be buried in. They were always told never to play over there because it was disrespectful and would cause the spirits to become angry. My grandmother and uncles, 4 of them, were actually smart and never played there. That is, until one day they were fishing in a nearby stream when they heard faint cries coming from the direction of the cemetery. My uncles had set up snare traps near the cemetery to catch rabbits, so that's what they figured the cries were. Rabbits weren't their favorite, but it sure as hell was better than government commodities, so they went out that way to collect their catch. To their surprise, the traps were empty, but the cries got louder. They hiked up a nearby hill to make sure that someone wasn't in trouble. That's where they found a small, haphazardly built cabin sitting at the base of the hill. Traditionally, you aren't allowed to build any structures within a certain radius of the cemetery out of respect. I think it's half a mile. And this cabin was only about 500 feet away. They had never seen it before and knew that whoever was in there wasn't Indian, because everybody knew the traditions. My grandmother wanted to go back home and tell their parents about the cabin, but my oldest uncle thought it would be a better idea to check it out first. On our reservation, the only thing you had to fear were possible mountain lions at night, so they weren't all that worried about some asshole trying to jump them. When they got to the cabin, it looked even shittier than up on the hill. The entire thing was clearly made out of garbage wood from a construction site. They thought about going in, but my youngest uncle noticed something dangling on a tree behind the cabin. Upon closer inspection, they realized it was a crudely made dream catcher made out of twigs and wound up leaves. I don't know about other tribes, but this was the symbol of a curse in my tribe, so my grandmother and uncles immediately ran home to tell their parents about everything. Apparently, from what they told me, their parents were those stereotypical wise old Indians that never seemed to leave a calm emotional state. But when they told them about the cabin and dream catcher, they started freaking out and decided to round up their siblings and other family living nearby to investigate. The kids were told to stay home after giving them a description of where it all was. Unfortunately, it was already dark by the time my grandmother and uncles got home to tell their parents, so it was too dark to find it again. They decided to call it a night and look for it in the morning. I guess my grandmother was freaked out and didn't sleep. It was about 3 or 4 a.m. when one of my uncles told her that they were going to go look for the cabin again. My grandmother immediately didn't want to go or to let them go, but my uncles assured her that everything was going to be fine because they were bringing guns. She didn't want to go, but she decided to anyway because she knew they were going to go with or without her, so she didn't want to feel responsible if something happened to them. They ventured out into the darkness with heavy-duty flashlights and guns. My uncles felt invincible, but my grandmother was scared shitless. They eventually found the cabin again, but the faint cries were gone. At first they were relieved because they figured it was a deer or rabbit during the day that wandered off, and that they were scared for nothing, until they checked to see if the dream catcher was still there and found it on the ground in pieces. This meant that a great evil, the curse, was released. They were all traditionalists, so they didn't even pretend they didn't believe the curse wasn't real. They were all about to book it home, until my oldest uncle, again, suggested going into the cabin. He figured that whoever built it was in there and he was going to kill him. Yes, he was ready to kill a man for that. He even told me himself. So they, reluctantly, went in guns drawn, and they found nothing. It was a simple cabin with one of those wooden spools as a table and a rickety old chair next to it. They were about to leave until they heard the faint crying again. Obviously, they were sufficiently freaked out, but what scared them the most is where they were hearing it from. It wasn't outside, it was inside, under the floorboards. Everyone was frozen trying to figure out how that was even possible. Until one of my uncles pointed out that there could have been some kind of basement under the spool. Immediately, my grandmother said no and told them they had to leave. Of course they didn't, and my oldest uncle went over to the spool and pushed it across the room. And they were right. There was a rotten-looking pallet over dirt stairs that led underground. Oldest uncle figured that it couldn't be that deep or that big, so he took the pallet off and got ready to go down. He always acted big and brave. He always seemed like it, but he really didn't want to go down. Luckily, he didn't have to. Right as he was about to take a step down, there was a loud crash at the door of the cabin that sent it flying open. They all raised their guns and aimed them at the door. I used to tell my grandmother that it was probably just the wind, but she always assured me that it was a strangely still night. They all stood aiming at the door for a good couple minutes when the crying became almost deafening loud and was emanating from all directions. They decided screw it and ran home. They weren't all running together, though. Some of my uncles were faster than the others. My grandmother made it back to their house with 3 of her brothers, but one wasn't back yet. Apparently, he was always the slowest, so just going inside and waiting for him was a thing. So that's what they did. At 4 in the morning, they left one of their brothers outside. My grandmother always gets pissed when I ask her why. Her reasoning was that he was a guy and had a gun. Besides mountain lions, there wasn't anything to worry about. They all eventually fell asleep in the living room waiting for him. Morning came and he still wasn't back home yet. Now they were all worried and had to tell their parents what they did. Their parents were pissed and had to rally up everyone in the area to search for him, figuring that he had just decided to camp out for the night, which was common back for them. They were less worried and joined the search. They searched all day and didn't find anything. They had even searched the cabin and in the basement. Again, nothing. Their parents were forced to call the tribal police, basically Indian cops that have a small department on the reservation. The parents and tribal police searched the entire reservation, which took 2 whole days to cover everything. There wasn't a single sign of him anywhere. This didn't make sense to anyone because everyone knew the reservation like the back of their hand. This specific uncle hated tricks and never played them on anyone, and would usually come home after a day of camping. Eventually, the state police had to get involved in the search, and again, they didn't find anything. Everyone gave up on the search after a month. The parents and tribal police brought one of the elders to bless the area of the cabin, then burned it to the ground. My grandmother and uncles told their parents and the cops everything. The parents believed them, and so did the tribal police, but the state troopers didn't. They figured that it was just a publicity stunt for our tribe because we were having legal battles about the sanctity of our land at the time. To this day, that uncle has been missing and is presumed dead. My living uncles always kind of joke about the whole thing, but my grandmother is always so remorseful about the whole thing, so I've only heard this story about twice from her. She says that sometimes she thinks she can hear his voice outside her house at night, but knows what might happen if she goes out looking for him. I've never stayed overnight at her house because of that. My dad was named after him, so there's that. Thank you to whoever read through all that. I personally can't confirm if that entire story is real because my grandmother's parents were dead long before I was born, but my grandmother and all my living uncles tell that story exactly the same.
How do I find my spirit animal or guide?
An important thing to acknowledge with a spirit guide or spirit animal is that it is not one entity bonding to you. It is a group of spirits that were attracted to you when you made an offering. Individual spirits will join and leave the mass each time you see it, which is why it will change over time, or as you see it in other places and circumstances. Its appearance, usually an animal, is something your mind gives it to make it easier to communicate. You may not even know you're speaking to an entirely different mass of tiny beings because they take a similar shape. For example, my grandfather's personal totem is the stag, a tall, proud male deer with long antlers. He represents duty and sacrifice. After I saw antlers in the sweat lodge and my teachers learned more about me, they told me my totem was likely to be the stag, just like his. Several times now, in circumstances where I made offerings to spirits, their visual appearance resembled a deer with long antlers. Maybe because I was being told to carry out some duty or sacrifice, maybe because I was told they might appear that way, or maybe because Stag simply wanted to introduce himself as Stag. His instructions are vague and open to interpretation. I have to accept all of those interpretations as potentially true, and take into account that what he tells me and how I perceive it could be good or bad, helpful or intentionally misleading.
Ooh, nice thread. I've been reading about circumpolar nomadic belief, and apparently there's shocking similarities between Siberian, Sami, and North Canadian and Alaskan belief. Can you tell me about your cosmology, how the world is constructed? Also, do you have any beliefs relating to the Northern Lights?
The creation story I was told was the story of Turtle Island. To summarize, people used to live in the sky, close to the sun and with wings to keep them in the heavens. One day, the first human, the Sky Woman, fell to the earth, wingless and pregnant. The earth, being entirely water, was dangerous for her in her weakened state, so a kind elder turtle offered to take her on his back. As her pregnancy progressed and she needed more space, Turtle's friend Muskrat went to the ocean floor to pick up soil. He would bring up tiny bits of dark soil in his paws and place them on Turtle's back. As soil was piled on, Turtle grew in size, and more animals took notice. They brought food, wisdom, and gifts from the ocean floor, and kept her safe and warm as she prepared to give birth. She had many healthy children this way, and shared with them everything the animals taught her. This process repeated itself many times, and eventually Turtle grew into a massive island full of life, the continent we stand on. He was kind and would gladly allow himself to become part of the Mother Earth if it meant he could provide for the humans that made their home on his back. He loved their mother as though he were their father and wanted her children to thrive. So he remains. In regards to northern lights, they have many meanings. They are a reminder that even in winter while she sleeps, the Mother Earth is very much alive. They are every spirit that has ever lived, gathering together to feast and refresh the land. They are life itself, making itself known as it flows across the sky. They are a sign of things to come, but also a reminder of the past. Open to interpretation, really. Before I go for a sandwich, I can start to talk about my first time firekeeping, my second sweat. This was right after I moved back to tribal land over 3 years ago. In a way, it could have been a second test to see if I was still serious about learning. I was told there was a sweat and that I would be firekeeping. Laughing Bear and Black Bear would give me some instructions, but they also wanted me to try and figure out what to do on my own. The firekeeper's job is simple, and he does not enter the lodge, but he is an equal participant and an important part of the ceremony. The sweat I was to attend was a women's sweat. For that reason alone, I have to be careful what I say. Even for women's sweats, the firekeeper is traditionally a man, though nowadays you sometimes have female firekeepers. Nobody objected to me taking the role. Women's sweats are just as intense as the men's, though they don't always go as long. Women who have been abused or assaulted, sadly common on reservations, will enter the lodge to find strength and move on. A grandmother usually leads the ceremony inside the lodge, but if none are available and the participants are comfortable with it, a male healer may enter and lead. This time the sweat was led by the same grandmother who attended my first one. For the story, I will call her Crow. Laughing Bear and Crow brought me to an old, wide river and gave me a big plastic box. I was told to fill it completely with smooth, round stones and that they should be of a decent size. It didn't take long, and Crow was happy I was there, so Laughing Bear didn't make her carry the stones like usual. It was hard for both of them, and I was the youngest person to be involved in ceremonies in a long time. Once we had the stones, I was given a big empty water cooler jug and told to fill it completely with clean river water. I had to wade in to avoid getting dirt or algae in the jug, but the river was quick enough that it ran clear. I was invited to stay with Crow overnight so I could start working first thing in the morning. Again, I would be needed to help build the lodge, and building the fire takes time. The lodge this time was a little bit taller, and the ground more dry. It was easier to build, which gave me time to work on the fire. There was a deep fire pit on Crow's property already, but unlike Laughing Bear's house, which was surrounded by trees, hers was in an open field. It was windy, and at some points it knocked over the lumber as I was arranging it. We had scrap lumber from old pallets, as well as fresh-cut logs and an old countertop to burn. I had to arrange it all into a pyramid, but with enough space in the sides for me to reach in with the pitchfork and pick up stones. It also had to be compact, though, or the stones would not heat up enough. I had to make sure the stones were surrounded by flame and glowing hot, but still reachable. It took most of the day to build the fire right. When the women arrived, everything was set up. I had been watching the fire silently, and Crow approved. She gave me a pat on the back and told me I was a fine young man for attending the women's sweat. While I was still focused on watching the stones change color, waiting for them to turn bright orange, I did get a look at the women who'd be entering the lodge. There were 5 or so, most a little over my age, but one looked like a teenager. I didn't ask any questions, but told them my name if they asked. They didn't say much either. I could only imagine why they were there. Crow took her long black hair out of the bun she had it in and let it fall loose. She offered to braid some of the younger women's hair, but they all declined. Then the ceremony went much the same way as before, but I was told to hand out the tobacco. I gave them each a small pinch, in order from oldest to youngest, and let them take their time walking around the fire and casting it in. The women all smoked from the peace pipe while the first chant was going like before, but some of them weren't accustomed to tobacco and coughed a little. It was summer, so they all crawled into the lodge in their light summer clothes and weren't asked to strip. I had to take a pitchfork and very carefully carry stones from the bottom of the fire to the pit in the lodge, one by one. Black Bear, being an experienced firekeeper, told me they were glowing well. My hands were shaking a lot, but I was able to keep it steady enough to bring the stones in. Nobody could help me. If I dropped a stone in the dirt, it couldn't be used, and if I burned someone, the ceremony might have to stop. I would carefully place the stone inside, then turn right away to get another. I wouldn't bring it in, though, until I heard the cedar burning on top of the previous rock. I was only guessing at the pace I should be taking, but nobody had problems with how I was doing it. Once I had finished the first batch, Laughing Bear handed me a large pot filled with the river water from earlier and a ladle. I passed it down the line of people to Crow, careful not to spill, and the door flap was shut. I took a seat by the fire again and tried to concentrate. The next batch of stones would have to glow just the right color, or the ceremony could be disrupted. I had to make the call on when they would go in. The first song I heard coming from the tent, though, frankly terrified me. It was different from the mixed sweat, and much more frantic. I couldn't understand the words, but I got the impression that something bad must have happened for this song to be sung. Crow was a quiet woman with a pleasant voice, but she could wail. Between the water sizzling and her shrieking, it was loud, even outside the lodge. I tried to block it out and watch the flames. It wasn't long before the other women started wailing as well. I couldn't hear if they had been prompted to join or started on their own, but there was definitely anger and sadness in it. It made my skin crawl, and my hands shook so bad I had to sit on them while I watched the fire. Black Bear asked if I was all right, and I just nodded. He didn't prod further. Even he was quiet. My grandfather was there, but he stayed away from the lodge, smoking and muttering to himself. He knew why those women were there, and he was angry. I didn't dare ask. When it came time for the women in the lodge to talk about what they were going through, I really had to focus. As soon as they were done, it would be time for the next batch of stones, and they had to be perfect. That, and I really didn't want to hear. I hadn't been told I couldn't listen, but I felt wrong just being there. I tried to shut out everything except the fire. After a few minutes, I did. I would watch the stones for how the glow moved across them as the fire licked them over, and try to take in every little detail. It was like the only thing I could hear was the crackling wood, even with the screaming and drums next to me. After focusing for long enough, I started to feel sick. It sounded like the women were nearly done speaking, but I'd started sweating heavily and got nauseous. When I heard them going quiet, I had to clench my fists and swallow down whatever I was feeling. I didn't really understand why, but I was incredibly angry. I could feel my blood boiling at the bottom of my gut, and it replaced the nausea before long. The next batch of stones was easier. My hands weren't shaking, and the stones didn't feel as heavy. I had to be quick, though. The healing would weaken if too much heat escaped. One of the women came out at that point and sat in the grass. I didn't look at her for more than a few seconds, but I could tell she was completely spent. Someone led her away, and I didn't see her again. The last part of the women's sweat was easily the worst. With no more stones to watch, I had very little to concentrate on. I made do with trying to see shapes in the sparks, but there were parts of the ceremony inside I could understand. Crow kept saying a name over and over, probably one of the women's, and then a long, wordless chant. She started hitting her drum faster and harder than before, and the other women started chanting too. It kept getting higher and higher and more shrill. There were only 5 voices, but even from outside it sounded like a lot more. If a panic attack were a sound, it would be that. It went silent before long, but the lodge stayed closed. Crow hit her drum occasionally, but there was no more singing or chanting. I guess that, like in my sweat, they had time to calm down with the heat still on. Also, like before, they stayed in when the door was open and cooled down. One woman came out and collapsed like I did, and I think she might have briefly blacked out too. The younger one walked out like she was fine, but was quietly crying to herself. The last woman to come out before Crow had a bit of blood on her chin, but I turned away when she noticed me looking. I think she had been biting her lip. She screamed into the open field for a moment, but didn't have much voice left. Someone came over, hugged her, and brought her away without a word. I kept staring at the fire until I was told to come in for food. Black Bear said I did well, and Crow hugged me, but nobody else said much. Only the younger girl stayed for meat and was completely silent. The others had gone after drinking their water. When I got home, I was still angry and full of hate until I went to sleep. I didn't know why. When I woke up, I was calm, but had pressed my nails into my palms so hard in my sleep that there was a little blood on my sheet.
I live in Appalachian Native American territory and have been having bad encounters with something in the surrounding woods. The mountains I live between have a bad history as is. Additionally, my coworker, who I haven't mentioned any of this to, saw something that fits the description in the road while driving home last night that threw a rock as he passed. I've wanted to ask the locals about it, but have been afraid of the LMAO Whitey treatment. Is there a suggested method to ward malicious entities?
Assuming it's not just some jackass throwing rocks, there are steps you can take. You don't ward malicious entities so much as you try to attract more good than bad, and the good ones take care of the bad ones. Two things you can easily do are carrying a medicine bag and smudging. The first thing I'd have to explain to do either is the medicine wheel. Pictured is my tribe's version. Most are very similar, but there are variations. The medicine wheel symbolizes the 4 sacred medicines and presents them as quarters of a whole circle. The place you live may have different medicines and beliefs, so let mine serve as an example. Black, sweetgrass. Calm, tranquility, peace. You can pick bundles of fresh green sweetgrass and tie them into a braid. Just having it around has a very light, pleasant scent that relaxes the spirits and makes them feel welcome. Burning it black in offering is even better. White, sage, strength, courage, willpower. Dried sage is pure white and can also be tied into bundles. They produce a very clean smoke that fills you with strength. Warriors would often smudge with only sage before going into battle or facing some kind of trial. Yellow, tobacco, healing, kinship, goodwill. Tobacco is a favorite of most good spirits. It is their preferred offering to be burned and easy to share with others. Pipe tobacco will do, but if you have the means to source completely raw, unpreserved local tobacco, get that. You offer it before and after a hunt, and during most ceremonies. Red, cedar. Knowledge, focus, learning. Cedar's flat needles glow bright and make a lot of noise when burned, giving you something to focus on and asking the spirits for guidance. By burning cedar, you admit that you are ignorant and need to know something. These are key to both the smudge and the medicine bag, and are the roots of Anishinaabe medicine. A medicine bag is typically no larger than your palm and made of soft yellow deer hide, including the cord. You can buy one at a powwow from a craftsman or maybe a reservation trading post. They're usually made with little extra scraps of hide and very inexpensive. The ones I've had were very small and plain, but larger, more elaborate ones with beads or paintings on them are just as good. It can be worn around the neck or just carried on your person, often under the clothes, but worn visibly is also acceptable. Normally I have mine tied to my belt and hanging from my hip, but my last one was stolen that way, so be mindful. I was walking home from work one night, and I guess some loser was hoping it was full of change or weed. The cord is soft deerskin and will snap easily, so mind it doesn't get grabbed or caught on anything. Find out what your local sacred medicines are, and add a small pinch of all of them to the bag. Then you seal it off. They usually have a pull cord or tie at the top, covered by a flap, and carry it with you. Then you will have the herbs for a smudge with you at all times, and the good spirits may follow you hoping for an offering. Adding very small personal mementos to the bag is also encouraged, like a bit of hair or small possession from someone you love, or a physical reminder of something that happened. Maybe something you feel symbolizes your tribe or family. Traditionally, you do not make a medicine bag for yourself. It must always be passed on in some way. Whether you buy, inherit, or find one, you eventually must pass it on too. When you feel that someone needs it more than you refill it and give it to them. They will have your goodwill and protection with them, always. Next, the smudge. A smudge is the smallest and most common ceremony, usually done alone. A full smudge requires a few extra materials which I will outline, but a simplified smudge can be conducted with just some herbs and a lighter. For the basic version, take a bundle of dried herbs like sage and ignite the end of the bundle with a lighter. Waft it around, blow on it. Try to encourage the heat to spread and produce smoke. You may need to burn it a few times before it takes and starts producing good smoke. Once it's started streaming smoke and there are some good embers going, take your free hand and waft the smoke over yourself, like you're bathing in it. If you have any kind of local feather, use that as a fan. The smoke should run over your head and wash over you. Note: a lot of rental agreements, including mine, don't allow you to do anything with smoke or incense in a rented space. While it's better to smudge indoors where the smoke can fill and suffuse a space, you may also do it outside. Don't get in shit for setting off fire alarms. For a full smudge, you need some extra materials. A local freshwater shell like a mussel, a feather, even one from a turkey or seagull will do, and a quiet space that you can close off and fill with smoke. This can be a bedroom or a tent, as long as it keeps most of the smoke in until you're done. You crumble small amounts of each medicine and form them into a pile in the shell. I use the bottom half of a mussel shell like a saucer and carefully light it with a normal cigarette lighter. Like before, you want to make sure it's producing a steady stream of smoke. It doesn't have to hotbox the room, but it should make a visible haze. My grandfather gave me an entire red-tailed hawkwing to use as a smudge fan, but a single feather is still adequate. Much like before, you fan the smoke over yourself and bathe in it, quietly and calmly. You don't ask for the spirits to come, you leave the door open for them. Smudging regularly makes it clear that you are a friend to the spirits and will welcome them into your home and life. It marks your home or whatever space you smudge in as a place where they are appreciated and invited to visit. You don't have to do it every day, but there's no harm in it. Before I moved back to tribal land, when I lived further south in the city, there was a hiking trail with a creek. I used to hike down to the creek and sit on a flat stone surrounded by water and smudge there. It became an important meditation space for me very quickly, since it was free from road noise and I would see little fish and dragonflies if I was quiet enough. Pick a space like that, one you feel a tie to. I think I've shared most of what I confidently could in this thread. I don't want to ramble and end up spreading misinformation due to my incomplete knowledge. I'll still try to answer questions that come in while the thread is up, but I'm starting to repeat myself a lot and would encourage people to read as much as they can from earlier in the thread. The books I cited are a good starting point for anyone with a casual interest in some of the things I've discussed and shared. I also want to thank people from other indigenous nations that have come in to share their knowledge and beliefs. It's been a pleasure seeing how many of us are out there and that there is still a sense of community across the nations in these troubled times. I hope that in the future Native American culture is something that can be discussed more freely and that more people around the world take an interest in spirituality, whether it's through our interpretations or their own. Finding spirituality gave me hope, and I believe it could for many others too. I rarely use 4chan these days, and this is the most time I've ever spent on /x/, but I'm glad I chose to do this here. You've been a very attentive and open-minded audience, and that's all I could have asked for. It's been humbling. From here, I'll start winding down my posting and close off with one last personal story. After going home from my first sweat, I was still trying to comprehend what I had experienced. I lived alone, far away from my tribe then, and had a lot of quiet time between work. So after a while, I started spending more of it trying to grasp what happened to me in the lodge. I didn't know anything about smudging or have any ritual materials, so my first attempts to reconnect involved just sort of meditating in my apartment while wearing the medicine bag my grandfather gave me. I had never put much stock into spirituality before then, mostly out of spite for my stepfamily's aggressive Christian beliefs, so I didn't really know how to meditate or pray. I doubted myself a lot and found it kind of embarrassing, but somehow it became part of my routine. The first thing I was able to do was shut out noise. I lived in a fairly dense, run-down urban area, and there was a lot of it. Road noise, people shouting, dogs barking, neighbors, occasional sirens or even gunshots. It took time, but the way I did it was visualizing a single flat plane, like a soft surface of memory foam or felt. I saw the noises around me as objects falling onto the foam and striking it without a sound, then sinking in until they disappeared. Later, this would become the still surface of the lake where my grandfather lives. I did this with the windows open, and after muting the noise, I tried to isolate certain sounds, like birds chirping or wind howling. I was really only guessing, but focusing on natural things felt right. I felt like I had gotten the idea of what I was supposed to do, but I still had poor mental discipline. I had a lot of worries and distractions, and was still nowhere close to getting over what happened to my girlfriend. So my focus was poor. I still had a handful of her possessions lying around, though, and after a few weeks of sitting with my eyes closed and thinking about stupid shit, not really meditating, I got an idea. I won't share the memory out of respect for her, but one of her things I still had was associated with an important moment in our relationship. I started bringing that with me to meditate and placing it on my lap, staring at it instead of closing my eyes. I was still not totally emptying my mind, but I was more focused on a strong feeling I associated with that item. Sometimes it made me very angry or sad, but I kept doing it. By the time winter started, I had calmed down some. I could use that item to bring myself directly to a specific moment, and was able to feel that same feeling over and over again. That became the basis of my meditation, trying to put myself back into a specific emotional state. That winter, my grandfather came south to visit. He had an operation booked, glaucoma, but the doctor he had to see was closer to where I lived. He stayed overnight and gave me some materials for the smudge, and I saw how he did it. He also told me a bit more about medicine bags, which gave me another idea. I couldn't smudge in my apartment and was still too self-conscious to do it out in the street, so I looked up green spaces and hiking trails in my area. I was able to find one, but it was a long walk, so I didn't go that often until spring. I took a different one of my girlfriend's things, a much smaller one, and put it into my medicine bag as a keepsake. It could have been placebo, but I felt a little more at peace after that. I brought it with me to the hiking trail, along with my smudge materials, and looked for a place where I could sit and continue what I had been doing. I found a spot under a big tree that was fairly dry, and sat there to smudge. While the sage and sweetgrass were burning, I tried to meditate as before, and go back to that feeling as I had learned. The first few times didn't go so well. It was cold and wet, and the wind often blew out the smoke or carried things off. There was a very cold, dry day, though, when I started to understand something. I did as before, but this time I tried to specifically recall how I felt in the sweat lodge. It took time, but before I was too cold to continue, I felt something. I blocked out everything in my vision and tried to imagine myself in the darkness of the lodge again, surrounded by the chanting and drums. I thought back to that bizarre but calming feeling I had when I felt hands on my back, and held it for as long as I could before getting distracted. I could only do this once for a few seconds before I had to go home and warm up, but it was exciting. Until spring came, I occasionally did it when I felt like I was in the right mindset. I could bring myself back to the lodge and feel what I felt in small, short doses if I concentrated, and tried to identify exactly what was happening. After some practice, I was able to feel that strange feeling for minutes at a time. I later found out that what I was feeling was supposed to be the love of Mother Earth, telling me she was there for me. The weather warmed, and I started going out to the woods more often. It became a normal part of my routine, usually once a week. I found a new spot, a flat stone in the middle of a creek, and took my smudges there. As the leaves came back to the trees and more animals and insects started showing themselves, it was getting easier and easier to tap into what I understood to be some kind of spiritual state. I started trying to watch the things around me while maintaining that state. I'd watch dragonflies and squirrels, birds and fish in that creek while trying not to let go of this strange warmth that felt like it was crawling up from the earth and through my spine as I sat. I thought about how all the leaves in the trees would be pushed by the same wind, but rustle and flap in different directions, and how the spots of sunlight that streamed between them would change shape as they did. I would watch them, sometimes for hours, and try to see shapes and patterns in how they moved, or how the edges of leaves would align for fractions of a second to form vague, erratic shapes. sort of like staring at a textured ceiling in different lighting conditions looking for faces. It was over a year before I was able to move back to tribal land permanently. But that time I'd spent learning to focus and put myself in a different state seemed to help when I was first learning. I used a similar method while firekeeping and while hunting and listening for moose. My teachers were happy with how well I listened and started inviting me out more often after I'd told them what I was doing when I went silent. Laughing Bear took a particular interest and became the one I considered to be my main teacher. My grandfather is my only direct family I have any real relationship with, but I trust Laughing Bear just as much, and I'm comfortable talking about anything with him. It helps that he has a great sense of humor. There are a lot of things I still don't understand or know how to do, but I hope that I can continue to learn from my elders and improve for a very, very long time. That will be all for now.
I've only heard a skinwalker story from this big Tongan guy who was doing a mission trip in southern Utah. They lived out in the middle of nowhere in a cabin on some Indian res or right off of one, I forget. He's a Mormon, so they wear the white underwear. That's relevant. Anyway, he and his buddy were eating dinner when he asked about skinwalkers. Apparently his buddy, a Utah native, went pale, well paler, and clammed up. Wouldn't talk about it. He kind of shrugged it off until one night they were making their way back from an appointment on the res and he was driving. His buddy said, "Elder," his last name, "you need to drive faster." Well, he had gotten hit by the res police for doing 28 in a 25, so he wasn't really eager for another ticket. He looked at him and said, "Are you joking?" And his companion just pointed at something out the window. It was someone on all fours running like a dog straight at them. He gunned it back to their home and pulled in, ran inside and locked all the doors. The guy had kept up with them for the whole 20 minutes back. The person or thing, which his companion now told him was a skinwalker, was screaming and hitting the doors and windows. Well, this guy is 6'4" and 350 pounds, and he's Tongan, so he told his buddy he was going to check on it. His buddy cried and begged him not to. He opened the door anyway and said, "Hey, skinwalker, come here and fight me, man to man." He said it was quiet for a minute, and then he heard a whisper to the side and behind him, off the corner of the house, say, "Why don't you take off your garments and fight me man to man?"
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more Greentexts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.